Last Sunday, Father Hamilton shared about the story of Rudolf Höss, who was a former Nazi commander who oversaw the extermination of 3 million prisoners in Auschwitz. And this man had a profound conversion experience back to the Catholic Church, ended up going to confession, and as the priest left, Rudolf Höss yelled out, "God has forgiven me, but the people never will." And when I thought about whether anyone would have forgiven such a man as Rudolf Höss, I was actually reminded about a great movie I watched. It's called The Hiding Place. It tells the true story of a woman named Corrie ten Boom. Corrie grew up in a devout Christian family in the Netherlands, and in 1940, when Corrie was 48 years old, the Germans invaded and took over her homeland. One night, there was a knock at the door, and it was a Jewish woman. Her husband had just been arrested by the Nazis, and she was in search of hiding place from Nazi persecution. And Corrie remembers looking at her 83-year-old widowed father, wondering what his response would be to this request. And he said, "In this household, God's people are always welcome." This actually inspired Corrie's family to join an underground movement that was providing hiding places for Jews and then arranged for their safe escape from Nazi persecution. And over a 2-year period, Corrie's family actually helped over 800 Jews safely escape from Nazi persecution. Amazing family. But one day, all this changed when someone betrayed Corrie's family, and they told the Nazis about this hiding place. And so the Nazis invaded their home, arrested Corrie and her older sister Betsy, and sent them off to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. And if you watch the movie The Hiding Place, you'll see that Corrie and Betsy were amazing witnesses of the Christian faith at Ravensbrück concentration camp. And they were set to be released from that camp on December 31st, 1944. But just days before their release, Betsy passed away due to the cruel conditions of that concentration camp. Corrie was devastated by the loss of her older sister and best friend. But she was so inspired by the example of Betsy, her love and forgiveness at that concentration camp, that when she came home back to the Netherlands, she became a full-time missionary. And she started traveling around Europe with a message of God's forgiveness during these post-war times. People were in such need of this message of forgiveness that she was on a mission to teach people how to forgive their enemies. And one year, Corrie actually decided to go back into war-torn Germany, back into that area where she was in a concentration camp. And she spoke about God's forgiveness at a church. She remembers everyone in dead silence leaving, but one man. There was one man who walked up to her. He was in this trench coat, and she recognized him. She knew this man well. It had been one of the most vicious guards at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, one who had personally mocked Corrie and her older sister Betsy as they were forced to shower naked. This is what Corrie says. "It came back with a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights, the pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor, the shame of walking naked past this man." And now he was here, standing in front of Corrie. "You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk," he began saying. "Did you know I was a guard there?" But since that time, I've actually become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things that I did there, but I'd like to hear it from your lips as well. Will you forgive me?" He stretched out his hand and waited for Corrie's reply. Corrie felt frozen in this man's presence, this enemy who had done such cruel things to her and her sister Betsy, and so many others in that concentration camp. Betsy had died because of this man's cruelty. Could he erase her slow, terrible death just by asking for forgiveness? Corrie said, "I can't do it. I cannot forgive this man." And she stood there, frozen. Then, in a moment of sheer grace, Corrie began to think, "I, whose sins had again and again been forgiven by God. I, whose sins had again and again been forgiven by God." Corrie remembered Jesus' exact lesson in today's gospel. She recalled that we must forgive our brothers and sisters from our heart. And so she said to Jesus, "Jesus, help me. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling." Corrie thrust out her hand, and as I did, she recalled, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, it raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands, and then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. "I forgive you, brother," she cried, "with all my heart." For a long moment, Corrie said, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. There's so much I could say about Corrie's story and what she teaches us about forgiveness. And if you want some great practicals on how we can actually live lives of forgiveness today, check out Father Hamilton's homily on YouTube, a great homily on forgiveness for today. For myself, I just want to focus on one key insight. Corrie's story gets to the heart of Jesus' lesson in today's gospel, that we as Christians are called to forgive because God has first forgiven us. I'll say it again, it's so important. We as Christians are called to forgive because God has first forgiven us. This is the message of Christianity. God is always the one starting. He's always leading. He's always first. He always makes the move. This is what happened in Corrie's life. She was frozen in the presence of this man, this enemy of hers. And then she realized, I whose sins had again and again been forgiven by God. She realized, because God has forgiven me first and shown me mercy, I can do it as well. To put this in the language of today's gospel, Corrie's like this servant who had just been forgiven this huge debt by the king, and she sees another servant, and she's ready to seize this servant by the throat and say, pay what you owe. But in a sheer moment of grace, she was able to rewrite the story of today. And she realized, I whose sins had again and again been forgiven by God. So today, we need to experience God's mercy and forgiveness first. We have to experience it. And then when we do, we can show it to others. And in my own life, there's one place where I experience God's mercy and forgiveness on a daily basis, and that's in Holy Communion. That's in the Eucharist. For those in a state of grace, that is, for Catholics who have not committed any mortal sins, that have not been absolved in confession, for those in a state of grace, when you receive Holy Communion, it actually wipes away all venial sins. This is God's way to show his mercy and forgiveness today. That's why the church actually gives us the words before receiving the Eucharist. Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only say the word, and my soul shall be healed. This healing of our souls is the wiping away of all venial sins. The Eucharist is the way that God today is going to show us his mercy and forgiveness. And this is what the Catechism says about this exact point. As bodily nourishment restores lost strength, so the Eucharist strengthens our charity, which tends to be weakened in daily life, and this living charity wipes away venial sins. We know this to be true, this parallel. Just as physical food restores our physical strength, God has given us spiritual food to restore our spiritual strength. And the Eucharist does this. It restores our spiritual strength by wiping away all venial sins. And this idea got me thinking. We have this great live stream system now at Mass. But if you had the choice between watching Mass virtually and being really here, if you had the choice to stay home and watch the Mass versus coming to Mass, you know what this is like? This is like preferring to watching a cooking show online instead of actually eating the meal. Cooking shows are good. I like to watch cooking shows, but I'd much rather eat the meal than watch a cooking show. Usually we watch a cooking show, we get really hungry, and then we go eat a meal. That's what it should be like watching virtual Mass. We should actually grow in a hunger for coming to Mass so that as soon as we're able to come, as soon as we are allowed to come, we should be hungry to come. Why? Because Jesus is giving himself to us in this meal. The Eucharist is not a piece of bread. The Eucharist is actually a person. This just blows my mind that when I'm distributing Holy Communion and I say the body of Christ, I'm not giving you a piece of bread. I'm actually giving you a living person. When I went to confession that first time after university, and I confessed hundreds of mortal sins. And Jesus wiped them all away. He showed me an abundance of mercy and forgiveness. And then I went to Mass. And that was the first time in which I realized that what I'm receiving is not a piece of bread. It's a living person. When I received him, I went back to my pew and I started weeping.